it's not like we have to get rid of anxiety and then we can be at home with the Father and the Son and the Spirit. Actually, the Father and the Son and the Spirit come to make a home with us in our anxiety.
John, when it comes to mental health issues, anxiety is right at the top of the list. And, I think post-pandemic, there are a lot of people that are struggling. There are people struggling before, but a lot more people are struggling now with this issue of anxiety, both in the church and outside the church. And it's something that I feel it would be very good of us to cover and to better understand what is happening with anxiety. And sometimes we could say some things in the Christian community that are so unhelpful to people that are dealing with anxiety. And we have a great guest who's going to help us with this.
Yeah, and Curtis Chang is joining us. He's a writer, speaker, and theologian, and has a terrific book. It's called The Anxiety Opportunity: How Worry is the Doorway to Your Best Self. And you can learn more about our guest and his book at our website. The details are in the program description.
Curtis, welcome to Focus on the Family.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's so good.
Yeah.
We're going to get to your personal story because what I so appreciate about it, who you are, is you're a person who has struggled with anxiety. Yeah. And so you're coming not only from a theological perspective, but from someone who had to do that. But before we get there, comment on just the general situation with anxiety in the culture. When we look at data and research, which we do here at Focus on the Family, this is a continually rising issue in our culture. How many of the Gen Zers are struggling with anxiety? It should concern all of us.
Absolutely. I think any listener to this show almost certainly either in their own family or extended family or friends in church has a child, a teenager, or even adult who's struggling with anxiety. The latest NIH statistics shows almost 60% of teenage girls suffer from very significant anxiety or depression. 1 in 4 have contemplated committing suicide because of how serious that condition is.
Think of that, 1 in 4. Yeah. Stop and just rest there for a minute. That's 25%.
It's an amazingly high number and should cause us to recognize something is wrong that we need to address.
When you look at it, you and I met at a conference, and I heard you speak, and I came back to the team and said, we've got to get Curtis Chang. Because first of all, I really appreciate the title of your book, The Anxiety Opportunity: How Worry is the Doorway to Your Best Self. Yeah. You said something at that conference that really caught my attention. It was the West and the way the church and Western medicine particularly misses the mark in going after anxiety. Yeah. Describe that for us again.
Yeah, I would say both the West secular mental health, but also the West church, evangelical church in particular, we need to make an adjustment here because what we're doing is not working. And what's not working is both the church and secular mental health are treating anxiety solely as a problem
to solve,
to make it go away, right? Because once we define something as solely a problem, we are like looking for a solution to make it go away. So in the church, this is where you get in a lot of traditions, the pray anxiety away. Just have enough faith and anxiety is supposed to go away because anxiety is a spiritual problem. It's either, in extreme cases, a sin or maybe just a lack of faith or a character flaw. So we're supposed to pray, read enough scriptures, and anxiety is supposed to go away. In other church traditions, maybe they don't spiritually stigmatize anxiety, but they still then just outsource anxiety to secular mental health and just say, well, we'll refer it to the secular therapist, psychologists, and so forth. And in that tradition, it has its own version of solely treating anxiety as a problem to go away. Rather than pray anxiety away, it's prescribe anxiety away, either with medication or therapy, which, just to be clear, both prayer and therapy and medication I have done, I'm a fan of. But when you engage that with this idea, this paradigm, this framework that says anxiety is solely a problem to go away, you go down a path that actually makes anxiety worse.
No, that's interesting. Yeah. Let's kind of reveal your childhood and what you were struggling with and take us through that. What was childhood like and where did that anxiety start?
Well, I think my anxiety started in a lot of ways, but what's interesting is in my childhood, I didn't have any terms or categories to label what I was experiencing in anxiety. I grew up as an immigrant family in a Chinese American culture. So in that sort of traditional immigrant culture, the response to a child feeling anxious is, don't be so anxious. You have nothing to worry about. Or just work harder, study harder, right?
Performance is big.
Performance is big, and there's just not a category for anxiety. And anxiety, in a sense, brings on shame for the family, that there's something wrong with the family. And so growing up, I actually was an anxious child, but I just didn't have any categories for it. And another reason why, I think, in addition to the cultural reasons, was I adopted what psychologists call highly functional anxiety. So what highly functional anxiety is, there's actually deep anxiety going on, but the person, myself in this case, has learned very functional behaviors to cope and cover over, at least temporarily compensate for the anxiety. So for me, it's planning, thinking ahead, working very hard, which turns out, if you do those things, you get ahead in the world.
Yeah.
But the anxiety is still there. And it's actually, in a way, a hidden engine for a lot of these behaviors of just really staying on top of things.
Right. Part of it in the story that I've read is, you were what is called a latch key kid.
That's
Describe how that aided your anxiety.
Right. So again, I'm an immigrant family. So both parents are working. So even as young as 8 years old, I'm coming home from school. And this may not be familiar to all younger listeners, but there was a thing called a Latch Key Kid, where even as young as 8 years old, you would go home and you would get a key from the latch, hidden somewhere, and you would let yourself in. And I would do that because I had two older sisters. They let out of school earlier. I was the first one to go home to this empty house. And I just remember this pit in my stomach feeling of opening that door thinking, and again, this is part of what anxiety does. It generates scenarios in one's head about what could be happening. And my scenario as an 8-year-old was, somebody broke in the house, they're ransacking the house, and as I open the door, I'm going to surprise them, and they are going to have to come down and take care of me, not in the good sense of take care of me. And so I would come home, let myself in, and if I heard a creak, it was an old house, if I heard a creak in the attic, I would go running back out to the front of the house out of fear that there was a burglar in the house. My sisters would come home, and they were like, what are you doing outside? And I would come up with a cover story, like, oh, I just wanted to play. I just wanted to get some fresh air, because I could not admit to them. I didn't have the language or the ability to admit to them, I'm feeling anxious. If we don't actually recognize and name anxieties going on, we have to do something with it. And so we, again, either pray it away, prescribe it away, or in my case, highly function it away.
Yeah. In that context, in the book, you say Christians are not spiritual latchkey kids. That's, understanding it, that's a beautiful statement.
Yeah.
What do you mean by it?
What I mean by that is we don't have to come up with our own coping mechanisms to kind of make anxiety go away or to manage it. We actually have a father and a son, a family in God who is going to come home, and in fact already has made their home with us, and actually has made their home with us in anxiety. It's not like we have to get rid of anxiety and then we can be at home with the Father and the Son and the Spirit. Actually, the Father and the Son and Spirit come to make a home with us in our anxiety. And this is the key thing that I'm trying to convey in the book, is it's not that we need to push anxiety away, pray it away, or prescribe it away, and then we can get our act together enough to have a relationship with God. It's actually through anxiety, not away from it or around it, but actually through anxiety. That is where anxiety is actually the opportunity for spiritual growth. And that's the invitation for all Christians.
Unfortunately, the world and social media and news and cable news, and it is kind of aimed right to that anxiety and to amp it up.
That's right.
And it's causing us great distress. Talk about that for a moment, just what our culture is experiencing right now. I heard about a study that was just done that showed that people who are concerned about climate, who are concerned about social justice, their anxiety level is exponentially higher than others.
Yeah.
What's happening with that? I've described it like a can of something has been uncorked.
Yeah, that can is called smartphones and social media. So if you look at the research of Jonathan Haidt, that just shows pretty persuasively that this hockey stick rise in anxiety especially among teens and children, but adults in general, is pretty strongly correlated with the rise of smartphones and social media.
Wow.
Basically, what's happening is we're getting bombarded with images that are designed algorithmically by the algorithm, right, to actually stoke anxiety, because it turns out that anxiety is a great driver for clicks.
It's sticky.
It's very sticky. You want to find the next thing. And this is part of the stickiness of when we try to make anxiety go away, not by going through anxiety, but just by coping it. We think the next swipe, the next information, that'll make me feel better. And the algorithms are actually set up to give you some relief momentarily, and then to ramp up the anxiety a little bit later to kind of keep you hooked on it. And so that's the external cause. And I think there's things we need to do as a society, as a church, to deal with the external drivers of anxiety. But I liken this to a storm, right? There's a storm that is caused by high weather patterns, pressure systems. That's like social media, technology, increasing isolation in our society. These are external factors we need to actually attend to. But if you think about a storm like Katrina, New Orleans, why did Katrina cause so much damage? Yes, there were these external factors, just like the equivalent to technology and social media. But the real damage was because the levees broke. Right? The structures that we'd set up to deal with these external factors were not sufficient. Were built on inadequate foundations. That's the message I'm trying to get out about anxiety. Yes, there are external causes, but the levees, the foundations, the biblical foundations that we have erected to deal with anxiety are built on flawed foundations, and that's what we need to address as well.
Curtis, there again are things that we say within the Christian community that are both helpful and sometimes unhelpful. I think Philippians 4:6, I think you referred to it as the Clobber Verse. Describe what that, tell us what it is, and then why is it used as a club? Well, it's the verse,
do not be anxious about anything. And it's often used to actually portray anxiety as a sin, as something that you should not have, and that Paul's statement in Philippians 4:6 is like saying, don't be anxious. You shouldn't be anxious. I could almost hear my mom and my parents and my culture speaking that to me, or you're supposed to pray enough so that it goes away. In my book, I go into more sort of exegesis for why I think that's a misread of Philippians 4:6. The most obvious reason is in Philippians 2:28 earlier. Paul talks about his own anxiety. About his own anxiety about sending Epaphroditus back to the Philippian church. He says, so that my anxieties may be addressed. So it would be very odd if, having just a few passages earlier, Paul saying, I'm anxious around this whole situation with Epaphroditus, he goes around and says, and if you're feeling anxious, you're sinning, right? So you shouldn't be anxious. So, and that's just one verse, but I think the most powerful biblical exegesis about anxiety is just to recognize that Jesus himself experienced anxiety. So all of the passages around his experience when he was about to confront loss, the loss of all losses, his death, in the Gethsemane, Matthew and Mark and Luke, or in John 12, in the John Gospel, all portray Jesus as emotionally distressed. The passages are talk about he's troubled in his spirit. He is in anguish. He has physical symptoms of anxiety. He's sweating so intensely that it's described, I think, metaphorically as sweating blood. Jesus is experiencing anxiety. Why? Because he's human. He is the one true human, right? And when human beings are about to or contemplating the possibility of loss in the future, they will experience anxiety. That is a natural human reaction that Jesus himself went through, not away or not around. He didn't pray it away, didn't make it go away. He went through it because that's what human beings are. And that's what true human beings do, is when contemplated with loss, the possibility of loss, we feel anxiety. And this is why it's important to distinguish anxiety from anxiety disorder. Right? Anxiety is the natural human experience, often experienced physiologically or mentally in the face of impending loss. Jesus himself experienced it. Anxiety disorder is the inability to handle, to hold, to experience anxiety. This is why I love the title of this show, How to Handle Anxiety. Not how to make anxiety go away, but how to handle it, how to hold it, how to experience it. That's what human beings are invited to do, because it turns out that just like Jesus went through his anxiety with the Father, we too have the invitation to go through anxiety in Jesus with the Father. and experience true transformation.
You know, in that analogy or that scriptural reference is so powerful because, of course, Jesus was sinless. And he did experience that anxiety in Gethsemane. And really his resolution to that was not my will, but your will be done.
Right. Yeah.
And relate that to the solution, when you're having anxiety, the trust that we have in God's care for us, no matter our circumstances.
Yes.
That will bring you hopefully a place of peace and rest.
Right. And this is where it's so important to not label anxiety itself as a sin or a problem to make go away. Because if we say anxiety is a problem to go away, what we're really saying is loss is a problem to make go away. Right? That loss itself is something that we should not experience.
Right.
And so if that's true, then we are going down a false gospel. Because what that means is we are then portraying God as the great sort of insurance scheme in the sky that's supposed to insure us from experiencing any loss, right? Because if anxiety equals loss, that means then we have to make loss go away if we're saying we're going to make anxiety go away.
But to a degree, isn't that our culture? I mean, we want all pain to go away. We want to bubble wrap the kids. We don't want them to get a boo-boo emotionally, physically. Right. So we're kind of, as a culture, I would say we are dead set on protecting our kids at all costs, and I don't know that that's healthy.
Well, and I think the Christian culture has absorbed that and spiritualized that in unhelpful ways, where we expect that the answer to anxiety is to pray it away, which actually means you're supposed to pray that loss that you fear does not happen, that God is going to protect you from that loss of job, the marital stress, your kids suffering, and so forth. And if that's true, then we're in trouble, because I think all of us who are Christians for a while have come to realize when we pray for loss to go away, which is a good, right thing, natural human thing to do, God does not answer every single one of them by saying, yes, I will insure you from facing that loss. Just like he did not, quote unquote, save the son from the loss that he experienced on the cross.
You mentioned a formula in the book. What's the formula with dealing with anxiety?
Well, I say anxiety equals loss times avoidance. So anxiety equals loss, right? Anxiety is what natural human reaction to the face of impending loss. We're going to experience anxiety because we're going to experience loss in our life. So I say loss times avoidance, because the one thing we can make anxiety go higher, the multiplier effect, is if we actually try to make anxiety go away, try to make loss go away, if we try to avoid it, right? And there's nothing wrong with asking God, so, hey, please take this cup away from me. Jesus prayed that himself. Yeah. But ultimately, we have to make that transition to say, but your will be done. Right? So this is where, if we can transition from avoidance to actually holding, where we can actually hold loss, manage it, handle it, suffer it.
What does that look like practically, though? I mean, you're dealing with this. You're a professor. This is what you're working with every day.
Yeah.
What does that look like? In fact, I think you have some very practical tools to help us do that. Yeah. What does that look like?
My book sort of outlines, I think, a pathway we can follow.
Yeah, like naming the loss.
Naming the loss is one of the most important things.
What does that sound like? Again, just help me, because I'm not sure I know what you're meaning.
Let me tell a story that illustrates this from my own most intense experience of anxiety. So what happened was I replaced the founding pastor of a growing church. Never a great job, by the way, I've come to learn, because a lot of people are sort of have their eyes on you, and you feel this great pressure to measure up to the founder. I took over just at the same time that the .com bust hit Silicon Valley, so there was a massive exodus of people from the region, from the church, giving goes down, and I'm in my first year as the pastor.
A lot of stress.
Replacing, a lot of stress. But I had internalized, again, this framework that anxiety is a sin, a sign, or at least a sign of lack of faith. And how could your new pastor go ahead and confess that I don't have faith, right? Or I lack faith. So I just tried to work harder, do more work, couldn't name what really was going on. I couldn't name, this is because I am suffering from anxiety, and anxiety about my performance and how all of you will think about me, right? So it's instead, I thought it's a workload, it's a lot of more pressures and demands. So then I generally sleep around 7 hours a night. That went down to about 6, then 5, then 4. And again, I couldn't name this as actually this is anxiety. This is classic signs of anxiety, loss of sleeplessness, right? Loss of sleep. Couldn't name it as such. Just kept naming it as my body doesn't need as much sleep because it's ramping up to face this
meeting the challenge.
Meeting the challenge, exactly. That's right. And then my sleep went down to 4, then 3, 2, and then I went through a 2-week period where I do not remember consciously falling asleep at all. I must have had micro sleep because your body can't handle it, but I don't remember consciously falling asleep for 2 weeks in a row, and that is torture. That is like your mind starts fracturing. It's an intense form of suffering that experience. And basically that I had a breakdown, and I actually had to leave the pastorate because I couldn't function anymore. It slid over into a deep depression. It got that bad because I could not name what was happening for me. And to name it as actually I'm feeling anxiety. I just had to push through. And that my coping mechanisms, my highly functioning strategies that had served me so well from 8 years old on, just broke down. And this is what can happen with people who seemingly are doing well because they have really high functioning coping mechanisms. But at some point, if they don't actually name and actually experience and deal with their underlying anxiety, it can lead to this kind of breakdown.
Yeah, I mean, that's a powerful story in terms of how to manage it and how to cope with it. You shared with us earlier you went to counseling. You mentioned that when you're dealing with that severe anxiety. When would you say it's time to get help? And what does that help look like?
Yeah. I think it's time to get help when it feels overwhelming, when you realize that I'm lacking the tools, I'm lacking the ability, or when you're feeling very alone, I think is another time to get really help. When you feel like things are very complex and you can't sort it out in your mind, having somebody else to help you be a listener and a mirror to you can be very helpful. So those are some of the common signs.
Curtis, one of the key pushbacks we will get, obviously, is how we integrate science, medication, and issues like anxiety. Address some of those common kind of theological and medical constraints that we suffer from in the Christian community.
Yeah. Well, I think mental health can be a very helpful tool to help us get our anxiety at a level where we can actually look at it. So, Psalm 139 says, "Search me and know my anxious thoughts." So this is a key part of how anxiety becomes an opportunity for spiritual growth, is where we can actually, in an invitation to God, invite him to help us know our anxious thoughts. What's really going on there? The challenge is sometimes the anxious thoughts have gotten so big that they actually overwhelm us, that we can't actually even look at them. They're just a monster, or they're so unclear in our heads. And this is where I think therapy can help us look at it a little more clearly, and then a medication can help bring the monster back down to a little bit more manageable size.
But also to not feel guilty if that is what is needed.
100%. Yeah, this is absolutely part of God's provision to humanity is medicine, and Christ is in all things. So done rightly, done with the right motivations, I think it's a perfect. And I've benefited from myself. The distinction I want to draw is that managing your anxiety, bringing it down to some manageable level, is not the same thing as spiritual growth. This is what secular mental health can't offer, is it can't actually offer anxiety as an opportunity for spiritual growth. It's still stuck it's a problem we have to either make go away or at least bring it down to manageable size. But it can't see it as an opportunity for spiritual growth, at least in the fully Christian sense. And this is where I think there's a helpful partnership between secular mental health and spiritual formation.
When you talk about being fully present, and describe that again so the person on the street can grab what you're saying, but being fully present, you say, allows anxiety to the possibility of anxiety to be better managed.
That's right. It brings it down to size, because anxiety is the fear of future loss, right? Anxiety is fear of something that's going to happen in a future scenario. This is why Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6, says, Don't worry about tomorrow. Come back to today. Look at the lilies. Look at the birds. He's trying to bring his listeners back to the present, because what happens is anxiety. One way to think about anxiety, it's a hijacker. It's a mental hijacker that basically hijacks us from the present moment into the future. And because the future is unknown, in the future, once anxiety has hijacked you into that future state, it could spin all sorts of scenarios, like a burglar has broken into your house, right? Because that's a future scenario as an 8-year-old I'm spinning in my head. So one of the ways that we bring anxiety back down to size, that you can do without medication, right? Or with medication even, or as a partner, is to simply learn practices, spiritual practices that are ancient Christian spiritual practices of leaving the future, of refusing to get hijacked in the future and coming back into the present with God. And things like breathing, meditation, scripture can be helpful in this. Nature can be very helpful as ways for us to actually get back to the present.
We're going to come back for more of the conversation with Curtis Chang in just a minute, but let me step in here and say thank you for watching Focus on the Family with Jim Daly. We have an opportunity to get more content to you, and if you'd like to access the top Focus on the Family shows, just check out our Best of 2024 audio collection. We've got the link in the program description below.
In this holiday season, I hope you'll consider giving back so that we can continue to provide content like this. We're listener supported, and we rely on the donations we get at the end of the year to plan for the next year of ministry. So please make a donation to Focus on the Family today, and share this video with your friends and loved ones who are facing anxiety. Not only will you be making a difference in their lives, but it's helpful for us to expand our reach and help more families. And now let's hear the rest of what Curtis shared. You know, being from a poor family, which I was, that caused me anxiety. I never really thought of naming it that way, but I would make excuses for why I didn't get the new baseball mitt or why I didn't have the football uniform. And, my dad's looking for it. He just hasn't picked out the right one. That's, that line of embarrassment versus anxiety. Speak to that understanding. When are we anxious and when are we just embarrassed about our surroundings or our circumstances?
I think it's important to recognize how much shame there is over anxiety. There's this sense that, especially if it's been spiritualized as a sin or a lack of faith, there's a lot of shame. But just generally, you feel weak. You feel not in control. And so invariably, we are tempted to be ashamed about that. And when Scripture tells us one of the ways we cope with shame is by hiding. This was the first reaction from Adam and Eve, right?
Yeah.
And so we can hide our anxiety by pushing it away, re-narrating it, pretending it's something else. I tell the story in this book of the time where I was pitching in Little League as I think it was a 10 or 12-year-old.
Everybody has a bad Little League story.
It's highly traumatic.
Why
That's
do we
right.
do this?
That's right. And in my case, I was being brought in to pitch for the first time, and I just could not throw a pitch anywhere near the strike zone. And it was because I was anxious, And when you get anxious, your body reacts a certain way. It tenses up, it clenches, the fluid motion you need to pitch completely departs from you. But I couldn't, right there on the pitching mound, name the reality that I was feeling anxious. Just like later in my adulthood as a pastor standing on the stage, I could not name the reality that I was feeling anxious. And so you come up with cover stories. You come up with ways to actually make it something that it's not. And that particular story was I was trying to indicate that the real reason I was having trouble pitching wasn't because I was anxious.
Right.
It was because the sun was in my eyes. And so I would do this very elaborate, oh my gosh, I'm just being blinded. I'm pulling my cap down, throwing my glove up to shield. And that worked enough till I somehow managed to get 3 outs through some miraculous intervention of God. And then I walked off and I broke down in tears as soon as I hit the sidelines because I couldn't keep up the cover story anymore. And so what that illustrates is we all have cover stories that we are prone to hiding our anxiety. And that actually gives anxiety more power. The things that we keep hidden actually have more power in our lives, and more power precisely because we're not looking at them, we're not naming them. And so they end up actually causing a lot of damage, not just on the field of Little League, but actually in the field of our marriages, our parenting, our jobs, where unrecognized and unnamed anxiety actually are in control, but we just don't know it.
Well, and what you're describing is that we learn these things in childhood.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what you're saying. We learn to cover up. We learn the ways of Adam and Eve.
That's right.
In essence, to cover up and to make excuses for things, and then we just carry that into teenhood, adulthood, etc. if we don't deal with them. In that context, some of the terminology that you're using sounds very rooted in psychology, but these are biblical things. I mean, we in the Christian community, we'll talk about, does the Lord have access to that closed closet door?
Right.
That's what you're relating to, these things that we don't want the Lord to see, these hidden things about our behavior, our attitudes, etc.
Right, and it's not just a issue that prevents us from managing anxiety. At some level, we do need to manage our anxiety so that it doesn't control us.
Right.
But the real opportunity, why I wrote the book, titled it The Anxiety Opportunity and not The Anxiety Management, right, is because actually the deepest invitation of God is to actually go through our anxiety as an opportunity for spiritual growth, to get at the parts of our heart that we ourselves don't want to look at or actually have some cover story around. Anxiety, if we're willing to actually follow its path and go through it, actually it's like the breadcrumbs that lead us to the actual state of our soul, that if we can follow that Psalm 139 injunction to say, search me, O God, know my anxious thoughts, know my innermost being, we will find actually deep realities that are actually like the keyhole to profound spiritual growth.
And so we all say, how do we get there?
Yeah. Well, we get there by recognizing that anxiety is the fear of some future loss. So one of the ways in which anxiety then becomes this opportunity, it becomes an opportunity to have God examine, how do we actually think and feel about loss? Because this is, again, I think one of the most important things for Christians to recognize is that Christianity, the life of following Jesus, is not a life of loss avoidance. We are so tempted to think that when we follow Jesus, what he promises us is a life devoid of loss, right? And which is why the anxiety becomes a problem, because we're like, wait a minute, what's going on? I'm feeling anxious. Well, you're feeling anxious because you are contemplating the possibility of loss. And if your only response to loss is, Jesus, make that loss go away, we will be disappointed, and we will have a crisis of faith, because God actually never promises us a life devoid of loss. Quite the contrary, Jesus says, if you want to follow me, you must lose your life, right? You must actually experience loss, because the real promise of the gospel is not loss avoidance or loss prevention or loss insurance. The real promise of the gospel is loss restoration. It's resurrection.
Right.
It's resurrection. And resurrection, you only get to resurrection through death. You only get to the restoration of life through the loss of life.
Getting back on the rails with our own avoidance of loss, you say there's two main types of habits that people fall into. Psychology would say this is right out of your brainstem, fight or flight.
Yeah.
So discuss that. What is that mechanism, and why is it there for everybody, and what does it do for us?
Sure. So this is a helpful way to understand what's happening in anxiety. What's happening in anxiety is we are facing some loss, but what's happening is, rather than realizing it's a future loss, we think it's happening right now. Because we've been hijacked into the future, right? So the job loss, the loss of this relationship, wondering what's going to happen to our kids, we think it's happening right now. And so our body is reacting with the same mechanisms that God gave us to handle threats in the present, right? So if there was a fire breaking down, if there was a wolf before us, our bodies are wired to respond with a fight or flight response. So fight is, I'm going to rally my body's resources and my mind's resources to fight the thing in front of me. I'm going to deal with it, okay? Flight is, oh my gosh, it's too big. I'm going to run away from it. And this pattern of fight or flight really characterizes, I think, a lot of people's different responses to anxiety. So for example, I'm a fight person. If I have a problem before me, if my daughters are struggling in school, I'm going to go into consultant dad mode. I'm going to be like, how do we get you more tutoring? How do we solve get you into a better class? And my way of then getting anxious is what is called rumination. This is where your mind just turns over and over and over, because you're fighting to get to a solution, right? That will make this loss go away. You're turning it over and over, around and around. You're fighting with it. Other people, like my wife, they're more flight people. They want to avoid the issue. So they want to change the topic. They don't want to talk about money if money makes them anxious, and they just want to distract themselves. They want to watch a movie. They want to go on social media. Frankly, a lot of addictive behaviors often people are dealing with some underlying anxiety by trying to distract themselves away from it through some other stimuli.
A coping mechanism.
Pornography, gambling, drinking, and so forth. And so what's helpful is for us, each of us, and this is another of the opportunity for spiritual growth that anxiety presents us, is it helps us to identify, wait, am I a fight or flight person? And what's going on there? And how can I actually, one, get back to the present, and then in the present, ask the Holy Spirit to give me some different responses rather than the fight or flight response.
I've never thought about this, but in marriage connection, typically, not always, and I get this, but typically we marry people that are generally opposite, extrovert with introvert. I've never applied it to the fight or flight mechanism. Like a fight person, I would put myself in that category. Let's take it on, let's go. Marrying a flight person, what kind of conflict can that create in a relationship?
It creates enormous conflict because what happens if we don't realize that what's going on for both parties is anxiety, we then attach moral judgments to these different responses. So this happens all the time in my marriage where I want to deal with something and my wife will be like, you're being obsessive, you're being, or anxious, or you're being compulsive and stuff like that. And that feels like a moral judgment on my anxiety, but I don't realize what's going on. Whereas I will judge her and saying, you're being avoidant, you're being, delaying, you're procrastinating, and so forth. And so we're actually judging each other for these sort of surface level reactions when underneath we're actually both anxious about the same thing, but we're just responding to it very differently, and now we're judging each other because of it.
How do you manage that?
Well, this is where, again, if we invite God to actually come investigate, to name our anxiety, we can actually bring it to the surface and realize, oh, this is what's going on. So now we have a shortcut in my marriage with Jody where we just say, oh, wait, I'm doing the fight thing. And she says, and she will oftentimes just do a running motion like this to signal, like
so
I'm
playful with it.
We're playful with it. We name it. We realize what's going on and realize, let's get to the underlying anxiety rather than our response.
Well, and it's good to know those mechanisms are at work in you. And most of the time, you're not even going to know it until you stop and name it, like you said. How do we stop avoiding loss and start holding it like you described? And what does that mean to hold your loss?
Yeah. One way to think about holding loss is to imagine loss as a rubber ball, right? Just imagine the thing you fear losing in your life. Again, your children, your job, your self-image, and so forth. If you imagine it as a ball in your hand, think of the avoidance moves as you're pushing it away. The away move. This is the away move, the avoidance move. Or you're turning it over and over in your head. This is the rumination, the around, right? You're getting stuck with it, thinking with one more turn, I will come up to this scenario where this loss goes away. Think then and imagine holding loss as just that, as just holding that loss in your hand, feeling the full weight of it. Another biblical term for this is grieving. Grieving is holding loss. Grieving is actually just not pushing it away or trying to come with a scenario where it won't happen. It's just saying, it happened. It is happening, or it could happen. And if it does happen, it will be grievous. I will grieve it. And when we can actually grieve losses, we recognize, oh, you can endure it. You can actually hold loss. It's not something we have to run away from or turn around it to make go away, or fight so that it goes away. Grieving teaches us that actually loss is holdable. And that's what Jesus did. Jesus grieved in the Garden of Gethsemane. And then I would say the second thing that Jesus did in Gethsemane is he didn't grieve alone. He wanted to grieve with his friends, his disciples. Now, it turns out his disciples could not stay awake and be with him, but Jesus wanted that. He recognized that grief, loss, was not meant to be endured alone. It was meant to be endured with others, with our friends, with our family, ultimately with God, such that even if we are abandoned and all our friends fall asleep at the wheel, like Jesus experienced, we still have the Father. But the best design that Jesus was signaling was do this with others, do this with friends. And then, of course, we learn the practices of prayer, where we are reminded that this loss is not final. This loss is held in the resurrection promise of the gospel.
Wow, there is so much in here. When does anxiety point to underlying idolatry?
Oh, that's a great question. So I would not say that every anxiety that people experience is a evidence that there is underlying idolatry, only that it could be. And this is why Psalm 139 says, "Search me and know me, see if there's any offensive way within me." Other translations say, "Is there any idolatrous way within me?" Because what idols are false promises that are been created by the world or by ourselves that promise you can avoid loss. If you worship me, you can avoid loss. If you obey me, you can avoid loss. This is from the very beginning in the biblical times. Before travelers would go on a journey of uncertainty or a child would be sick, they would sacrifice to an idol. Because idols they prey on our anxieties because they make a false promise. If you obey and worship me, you can avoid loss. And this is why anxiety is a profound opportunity for spiritual growth, because it's an opportunity for God, through the Spirit, to investigate our anxieties and see, as Psalm 139 says, is there any idolatrous way within me? Am I clinging on to some idol here to deal with my fear of loss rather than the resurrection promise?
Yeah, that is so profound. Since I was a kid, I've always scratched my head why people knock on wood. To not be injured, to not be hurt.
That's right.
That's never happened to me. And then they knock on wood. I remember being 8 years old going, why are they knocking on wood?
Well, human beings deep down hate loss. We want to avoid loss. So we will go to superstition. We'll go to idols. We will distort the gospel even to make it to be a loss avoidance scheme.
But that's powerful. And I think we need to be mindful of it, that somehow deep rooted in our human nature is this desire.
Totally.
And it's kind of getting to the core issue, isn't it?
Yeah. And the desire is natural. Like, the question is, are we able to actually bring that to God and submit our fear of loss to God's promises?
Putting that in the parenting context, I mean, for Gene and I, this has always been, the mountain and the molehill.
Yeah.
Hun, that's a molehill. No, it's not. It's a mountain. And I could see that anxiety in the parenting picture bright and clear.
Yeah.
And usually one of the husband-wife team is not as worried, and the other one's hyper worried.
Yeah.
Generally, we kind of catastrophize, whatever that word is, the idea of what our future children are going to be like.
Totally. I write about this a lot in my book because that is a paramount anxiety I suffer from. I think it's such a great and important point with so many of American teenagers, again, over 60% almost, suffering from anxiety. It means behind every anxious teenager are anxious parents, right? So, and I think listeners out there are probably know what I'm talking about, is when your kids are anxious, you are anxious. And so this then is actually an opportunity for spiritual growth for the parents. The parents have to do their own work.
So this isn't a teaching opportunity per se for the child. It's really for me.
Exactly. It's both, right? But the temptation is to externalize all of it and say, you get fixed, not realizing, actually, I have my own anxiety I'm bringing into this whole equation. And even my desire to fix my child is deeply bathed often in my own anxiety that they're not going to be okay. I got to get them okay, and so forth. So anxiety of our kids is an opportunity for spiritual growth, to deal with the anxiety of the parents, and for all of our own sort of coping mechanisms that are in play, all of our own false beliefs. For me, the anxiety of my children was a recognition through this, search me, know my anxious heart process with God, was recognizing that I had an idol in my own parenting. My idol was the cultural idol that I grew up with as a Chinese American, where my kids are a reflection of me. They're an extension of my identity. So how they are in the world is an expression of how I am in the world. And I'm making them a little idol, right? To say they've got to be okay for me to be okay. And parenting is done poorly when you are living with that kind of idolatry of your children.
I don't think that's an Asian American thing. I think it's everybody's
right.
thing.
It's especially intense in Asian Americans, right? Because our face, our reputation in the community is so attached to how our children do
the behavior,
their performance, what schools they get into, and so forth. And this was my opportunity for spiritual growth was to realize, oh, the anxiety of my kids is triggering my own anxiety. And that anxiety, if I actually ask God to investigate it, there is an idolatry underneath all of that.
No, and that's so powerful. And, the key is, how can parents help their kids who are dealing with that anxiety? And in practical ways, what can we do to help our children if they're tipping toward not just managing or mismanaging anxiety, but they're becoming compulsive with anxiety?
Well, I think obviously get them the help they need, and that's going to be on a very individual basis, whether it is counseling, medication, therapy, group support, whatever. There's no one-size-fits-all prescription here. So get them the help they need. But I also think, as we've been talking about, is also recognize that you have your own anxiety in play and do the spiritual work of actually growing through that anxiety. And I think if they do that, this will enable them to actually apply the most powerful parental intervention that a parent can apply to their child, which is actually more powerful than even get them to see the right therapist or get them on the right medication, which is acceptance, which is deep, deep acceptance. Because that is the one thing that actually parents can deliver more than anybody else, more than any professional can, is that they are accepted. And that is a deeply reassuring truth and reality for any anxious person to experience.
And I really want to punch this, because on the other side of that, we also have the power to communicate not being accepted.
Disapproval, right?
I mean, that's as high as the other.
That's
and we've
right.
got to be very mindful as a parent to make sure that we are showing our children acceptance and
Right.
love versus pushing them toward groups that will also offer acceptance.
Yeah,
But it's unhealthy.
that's right.
Right? Right at the end again, let's hit it. How can Christians tangibly remember the promise of the resurrection? You mentioned it. I'd love to end there.
Yeah.
Why not? This is what it's all about, is the resurrection of Jesus and what he sees in us. So the importance of that once again.
Well, this is a larger topic, but I think anxiety actually offers an opportunity, because it actually says, okay, if I can actually name the loss that I'm feeling that is triggering this anxiety, I can imagine that loss. And then can you imagine going through that loss and having the resurrection on the other side, where that loss is restored to us? So if I'm fearing the loss of a job and the economic insecurity, can I imagine going through that and the resurrection day, when the feast is laid out on the Mount Zion, where there's no want, there's no need anymore, right? So I think there is actually something here to cultivate the Christian imagination for what happens on the other side of loss, which is a beautiful picture of bodily resurrection and the restoration of all things.
Well, and frankly, the answer is hope.
Yeah.
The hope for that.
Yeah.
That this is only the dry run, down
right.
here, and we're going to
Yeah.
hit obstacles, and the Lord said that.
Yeah.
And, they're going to persecute you because they first persecuted me. How about that one? And I think in that context, that's why I was so excited, Curtis, to have you on the program and to talk about this great resource, the Anxiety Opportunity. It's a different approach about how we see anxiety, and especially in a culture that anxiety is growing exponentially, for the Christian community to go deeper and better understand the tool that God provides us here to get closer to him. This is brilliant. So thank you for being with us.
It's been a pleasure to be with you guys.
I so appreciated that conversation with Curtis and his willingness to share his story. That takes real courage. And I hope you feel equipped to manage the anxieties you're dealing with and to encourage anyone you love who is struggling. Here at Focus, we want to help you and your family thrive in Christ, which is why we provide so many free resources like counseling, podcasts, and a website full of articles. We are a nonprofit ministry, and the way we keep those resources free for families like yours is through donations. So please consider giving back to the ministry this holiday season. And during the end of the year, it really helps us plan for the future of the ministry. Your donation will help us continue to give families hope.
And let me recommend you get a copy of the book by Curtis Chang, The Anxiety Opportunity, which has so much more wisdom to share than we could cover here. When you make a donation of any amount to the ministry of Focus on the Family, either a monthly pledge or a one-time gift, we'll say thank you by sending a copy of that book to you. Donate and get your book by calling 800, the letter A and the word family, 800-232-6459. Or we've got details in the program description below. Well, thanks so much for watching Focus on the Family with Jim Daly. I'm John Fuller, inviting you back as we once again help you and your family thrive in Christ.